The cabin was sealed when they found it, not locked, sealed. No footprints, no carriage tracks, and no one, not even the sheriff, could explain the 4 mounds of freshly packed earth beneath the floorboards. Ezekiel Whitmore had vanished, and so had his wives. They say Utah was meant to be a place of salvation, a new Zion for the persecuted faithful. But salvation is a mask. Behind it, power, obedience, and blood. You're not just watching this to be entertained. You're watching because something in you already knows the world you've been told to believe in isn't the world that exists. And in 1847, that veil was torn wide open in the high mountain valley of the Salt Lake frontier. Ezekiel Whitmore wasn't the first man to claim divine revelation, but he may be the only one to have convinced 4 intelligent, capable women to follow him into isolation and disappear without a trace. They weren't just wives. They were participants, witnesses, perhaps even sacrifices. This isn't just a mystery. It's a window, a mirror, a warning. And if you make it to the end of this story, you'll understand why it was buried for over 70 years, hidden in church vaults and sealed archives. Not because it was false, but because it was too true. The doctrine of blood atonement was whispered about in the earliest Mormon sermons. The idea that some sins were so severe, only death, ritual death, could cleanse the soul, officially denied. But unofficially, the whispers never stopped, and Ezekiel had ideas, not just about family, but about eternity. He believed his household had been chosen for a higher covenant, a ritual cleansing, an eternal sealing through sacrifice. Now ask yourself, why would 4 women follow 1 man into frozen wilderness, knowing they'd be cut off from the world for an entire winter? What did he promise them? And what did they believe they were becoming a part of? This isn't history class. This is initiation. You're not just here to learn what happened. You're here to remember what's always been happening, beneath the surface of faith, control, and the institutions that promise salvation. The journal found beneath Rebecca's floorboard, just 1 line, ink trembling from a shaking hand, revealed the truth that would shatter everything the church tried to preserve. E says we must all make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of the eternal family, but I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven. Understand this, Ezekiel Whitmore wasn't some backwoods lunatic. He was articulate, respected, devout. He built that home by hand, gave each wife her own room, and ran his household with almost surgical discipline. But beneath the structure, a sickness festered. Not madness. No, something far more dangerous: belief. You see, belief becomes deadly when it's shaped by isolation and hunger and guilt. And Ezekiel, he was devouring sermons about eternal glory, blood rituals, celestial hierarchy, twisting doctrine into doctrine, until one night he wasn't praying anymore, he was preparing. Sarah, the first wife, devoted, barren, obedient. She was the first to depart. Ezekiel claimed she had a sister in Missouri, that she had a calling. But Sarah had no sister, no family, no path through the snow, and there were no footprints outside the cabin. When Ezekiel came down from the mountain to tell the bishop, he trembled like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Not grief, not sorrow, guilt. His eyes flicked to the door like he feared someone might hear what he'd done. And maybe, deep down, he knew someone had. But the church couldn't afford scandal. Not in 1847. The federal government was circling like wolves. Polygamy was illegal. Mormon settlements were fragile. And if the truth came out, that a husband had possibly killed his 4 wives in a blood ritual inspired by misread doctrine, then the whole foundation of Zion would crack. So they made a choice. Watch. Wait. Don't interfere yet. But something was already unraveling. The other wives, Rebecca, Mary, Ruth, they didn't run. They didn't leave with trappers or missionaries. They vanished, one by one. And Ezekiel's stories kept changing. If you think this is just a tale about murder, you're not listening closely enough. This is about the architecture of control. What happens when authority, divinity, and secrecy collide in the wilderness, where there are no laws but the ones a man invents in the cold silence of God's absence? On January 30th, 1848, Ezekiel returned to the main settlement with hollow eyes and hands that shook like kindling in the wind. Rebecca's gone too. He whispered to Bishop Curtis, the Lord called her east, to teach in a mission school. But there were no schools that winter, no eastward caravans, no travelers. The mountain passes were sealed by drifts 12 feet deep. Anyone attempting to leave would vanish beneath ice and wolves within a day, and yet Ezekiel insisted they had gone. No witnesses, no letters, no physical evidence of travel, just words, the bishop pressed. Ezekiel's story fractured. First, it was missionaries, then trappers, then angels in disguise. By the end of the interview, he was weeping and muttering that obedience demands sacrifice. That phrase would haunt the bishop, and so a decision was made. February 3rd, 5 men rode into the frozen hills to the Whitmore homestead. What they found was silence, no smoke, no laughter, no sounds of life. Only Ezekiel, pale as wax, stirring cold ashes in the hearth. "They're gone," he told them. "All gone." And the way he said it, not grief-stricken but relieved, terrified them. He took them room by room, showed them tidy beds, empty closets, furniture untouched. But something was wrong. Too clean, too fast. No signs of farewell, just absence. Behind the cabin, the earth had been disturbed. He called it root cellar expansion. But the men could see the ground was frozen solid, yet someone had dug through it. Recently, and extensively. That night, one of the men, Thomas Garrett, awoke to the sound of faint weeping from beneath the floorboards. Not wind, not settling timber. Human weeping. He never forgot it. But the most disturbing part wasn't what they saw. It was what they didn't see. No women, no personal warmth, no scraps of cloth, no scent of cooking, no stray hairbrushes or dropped embroidery needles. It was like they had never existed. Ezekiel served them preserved food. Nothing fresh. He claimed illness had taken the women, claimed they'd recovered and left. But no mother leaves without her child's keepsake. No wife forgets her journal. No human being erases their life so completely unless something, or someone, forces them to. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a ritual erasure. It's not the absence of sound, it's the absence of the living. When the bishop's party returned from the Whitmore cabin, they brought no bodies, no proof. Just a lingering sickness in their bones. A feeling that something had watched them from beneath that house. Not a man, not a woman. Something. The church leadership held a private meeting that same night. No minutes were taken, no records kept. They understood the stakes. One whisper of ritual murder in a plural household, and the federal government would come down like a hammer. Plural marriage would be criminalized. The settlements would be seized. Their Zion, the entire Mormon dream, would collapse. So they did what powerful institutions always do when truth threatens the foundation. They buried it. But the whispers didn't stop. Stories spread in secret. The Danish family 3 miles north claimed they saw strange lights near the Whitmore cabin late at night, circles of fire, chanting, figures standing perfectly still in the snow for hours. Children heard voices in the trees. And then came spring, April 1848. The thaw peeled back winter's white mask, and underneath, secrets waited like corpses beneath linen. The bishop led a small group back to the property. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The area behind the cabin, where Ezekiel had claimed to be digging a root cellar, was nothing of the sort. It was a grave, but not a single one. Multiple trenches, disturbed soil arranged in arcs, fire pits surrounding the area like sentinels. Within the ashes, burned parchment, half-melted rings, and fragments of cloth, personal, intimate, ritualistic. Then they found the journal, Rebecca's, hidden beneath the floorboard. One sentence, scratched in desperation. "E says we must all make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of the eternal family." But it was what came next that changed the tone from horror to prophecy. "I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven." This wasn't madness. This wasn't despair. This was doctrine twisted into ceremony. Understand this, Ezekiel believed he was saving them, not destroying them. He believed he was sealing their souls to him forever, in blood, under heaven's gaze. But something else had been whispering to him, not God, and now it was whispering to others. This isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a blueprint. 1 man, 4 wives, 1 terrible secret, and we're just beginning to uncover it. Not because he was clever, not because he had help, but because no one wanted to find him. After the thaw, after the graves were unearthed and the personal items recovered, after the bishop's hands trembled while flipping through Ezekiel's notebooks, the church did what institutions always do when faced with undeniable evil. They closed the book. The official record reads, "The Whitmore women left for the East. Their whereabouts remain unknown." But the real record, the hidden one, tells a far darker story. Inside the cabin, concealed behind a false wall, they found scrolls, not Bibles, not the Book of Mormon, not even Apocrypha. These were hand-bound texts, Ancient diagrams, sigils, annotations in languages no one could identify. Latin, maybe. Hebrew, perhaps, but twisted, like scripture put through a fevered dream. The drawings showed human forms with open chests, hearts removed, circles drawn around kneeling women, and a central figure with light coming from his eyes or fire. The final page, a man and 4 women ascending into clouds, their feet dripping blood. It was labeled, "The Marriage of the Slain." Ezekiel didn't just believe. He transcended belief. He entered a feedback loop of spiritual certainty, one that no authority, no bishop, no scripture could interrupt. That's what made him dangerous. Not that he was insane, but that he was certain. His notebook spoke of visions. A pillar of light that came to him in dreams, showing him the future of his bloodline. He wrote of a voice that called itself the architect, instructing him to bind the feminine in fire and earth, promising ascension through obedience, pain, and unity. But this is where it turns. In one passage, Ezekiel describes his wives behaving strangely. Long before their deaths, he claimed they began speaking in unison, moving like reflections, dreaming the same dreams. He believed they had become one soul in 4 vessels, what he called the bride of completion. He believed it was his divine duty to offer them up, not because he hated them, but because he loved them too much to let them stay human. That's the sickness we rarely talk about. When love fuses with power and devotion mutates into domination, that's when a man stops seeing a person and starts seeing destiny, and that's when blood becomes a sacrament. Comment the phrase, the bride of completion, twice if you're beginning to understand the cost of truth. It marks you. It binds you. The face of Ezekiel Whitmore wasn't monstrous. It was calm, gentle, even noble. The kind of face that kneels in prayer, that builds homes, that speaks of salvation with quiet conviction. But conviction without accountability is how atrocities are born. And in 1847, high in the Utah wilderness, that conviction turned deadly. Inside Ezekiel's final journal, buried beneath the hearthstone, wrapped in cloth soaked with what looked like dried blood, he wrote, "She is no longer Sarah. She is light, Bera." She spoke in a voice not her own. She told me what must be done. I wept, and then I obeyed. You see, Ezekiel believed he wasn't killing his wives. He believed he was setting them free. He described them as vessels filled to overflow with the Spirit, each one a stage of a cosmic transformation. Sarah was preparation, Rebecca illumination, Mary cleansing, Ruth ascension. Each had a role, a purpose, a price, and he was the one chosen to pay it. But if this sounds like madness, stop and look around. How many institutions throughout history have declared obedience to a higher law to justify the slaughter of the innocent? How many leaders have convinced others that death is a form of purification, that violence is holy? The blueprint is always the same: isolation, revelation, devotion, sacrifice. What makes Ezekiel different is that he didn't hide his intentions. He believed that one day others would come, men like you, men who would see not murder but a template, a method, a sacred path. Because here's the truth few will say out loud: Ezekiel didn't just disappear. He was allowed to disappear. He was never captured, never tried, never publicly condemned. Church leaders closed the investigation. The state refused to intervene. His cabin was dismantled, the land repurposed, the archives sealed, because they feared what would happen if the world knew that under the right conditions, in the right context, with the right scriptures, any man can become a prophet of blood, and worse, he might be followed. So ask yourself, how many others like Ezekiel have there been? And how many of them never got caught? Most monsters don't come out of the woods. They come out of churches. Ezekiel Whitmore wasn't created in a vacuum. He was forged slowly, meticulously, by doctrine, tradition, and silence. You don't get a man who justifies the murder of 4 women without a system that teaches him women are vessels, obedience is holiness, and sacrifice is glory. That system wasn't just Mormonism. It was something older. The journal found beneath Rebecca's bed included strange entries long before her final, terrified sentence. She wrote of dreams, recurring ones, standing at the center of a burning circle, her hands bound in red ribbon, Ezekiel whispering, "You are the gate." She heard music in the walls, saw symbols in the snow, and began waking with blood at the corners of her mouth. No fever, no illness, just the slow bleed of reality slipping. This is the part the church scrubbed from the records. Rebecca had started asking questions, not about her place in the family, but about Ezekiel's God. She claimed his visions contradicted scripture. She told Sarah one night, "That voice Ezekiel hears, it doesn't feel like heaven, it feels like hunger." But by then, it was too late. The women had changed, not just emotionally, not just spiritually, physically. Neighbors who visited in early December said the wives moved in eerie synchrony, like dancers following a silent conductor. They spoke less, ate less, slept in unnatural positions, curled tightly on the floor in geometric patterns. Rebecca began writing symbols into the frost on the windows, circles within circles, stars without ends, language no one recognized. And Ezekiel, he began referring to himself not as a husband, but as a binder. In his hidden manuscripts, he described the creation of an eternal knot, a sacred configuration of 4 feminine forces united through one male principle, sealed by blood. It echoed ancient Kabbalistic and Hermetic rituals, but filtered through the lens of 19th century frontier theology, a perverse alchemy of desire, faith, and control. He wrote, "They are not mine to keep. They are mine to bind through pain to the wheel of the heavens." This wasn't polygamy. This was spiritual engineering. And if you think this was unique to Ezekiel, think again. The blueprint exists. The doctrine lives. The institutions still breathe. They just wear cleaner robes now. By the time Bishop Curtis returned to the cabin for the last time, the air inside felt wrong. Not empty. Saturated. Like the walls were holding their breath. Like the floorboards remembered. The investigation, if you can even call it that, was unofficial. Quiet. Controlled. Because by then, the church had made its decision bury the story to preserve the larger mission. The building of Zion could not afford ghosts, especially not 4 of them. But Curtis kept a private diary. Not for the church, for himself, and in it he wrote something chilling. There is no peace in that place. Only containment. The silence there is not absence, it is imprisonment. Behind the cabin they found it, a wide trench beneath a layer of fresh topsoil, lined in stone, shallow, but deliberate, ritualistic. Within it, nothing human, but too many signs, fragments of burned cloth. A twisted iron ring that matched Mary's wedding band. And the worst of it, a wooden carving shaped like a woman kneeling, head bowed, arms outstretched in supplication. Her torso was hollowed out. Inside, they found scorched parchment. 3 letters burned into the wood. A.E.C. Curtis believed it stood for Aeternus Ecclesia Conjugium, the eternal marriage of the church. This wasn't just about Ezekiel. This was about theology weaponized, doctrine used like a blade, the divine rewritten in blood. Later in Ezekiel's final notebook, another phrase repeated again and again, growing larger with each entry until it consumed the page. Bind them to the wheel, bind them through fire, bind them to him. It's here the story splits. Some say Ezekiel fled south into the Arizona territories, hiding among other outposts, protected by sympathetic elders who believed his visions had been misunderstood. Not evil, just excessive. Others believe he never left. There were rumors for decades of a silent man seen near the canyon passes, always alone, always watching Mormon caravans from afar. They called him the bridegroom in shadow. And every year, when winter came, some claimed to hear a voice chanting softly near the abandoned Mill Creek site. But the truth is simpler. He didn't need to survive. His ideas did. And once an idea like that infects a system built on obedience and secrecy, it doesn't die, it waits. The church sealed the records in 1850. 3 years after the last confirmed sighting of Ezekiel Whitmore, the First Presidency issued a quiet directive no further inquiries into the matter were to be made. His journals, the bishop's diaries, and the recovered artifacts were placed in a vault beneath the Salt Lake Temple, classified under a code name that would later appear in only 2 more documents. Project Halcyon. You won't find it in public archives. You won't find it in family genealogies. You won't find it in any church-published history, because it was never meant to be found. But secrets buried in stone eventually speak through cracks. In 1920, during construction of a new meeting house on the edge of the old Mill Creek property, workers discovered bones beneath the foundation. Not in coffins, not in graves. Piled, folded, arranged like an offering. 4 sets, all female, no clothing, no jewelry. Only teeth fragments, hair, and traces of something black and tar, like coating the remains. Burn residue mixed with tree resin. And at the center of the pit, placed atop a ring of smooth, white stones, was a wooden carving, identical to the one Bishop Curtis had once described. The church sent in their own investigators, told the workers they had uncovered an ancient native burial site, paid them to remain silent, and within a week, The bones were removed and sealed in an internal archive labeled non-canonical relics. Do not disclose without authorization. But the damage was done. One of the workers, James Ellison, kept a piece of the carving, said it made him feel sick to touch it, but sicker to let it go. It showed up decades later in an estate sale after his death, bought by an antiques dealer in Ogden who claimed it. Whispered. When the lights were off, we laugh at that sort of thing, until we remember what people like Ezekiel believed. That wood can hold memory. That sacrifice leaves impressions. That blood, when spilled for divine purpose, doesn't just vanish. It imprints. And here's the truth that made me start digging into this story. In the first place, Ezekiel's journals described rituals almost identically to those used by fringe sects in the 20th century. Groups that didn't know each other, never connected, yet somehow mirrored his exact steps. That's not coincidence. That's contagion. We're not dealing with a murder mystery. We're dealing with an infection. This isn't just about Ezekiel. It never was. It's about what happens when a pattern hides inside a belief. When a system teaches a man that he is the chosen interpreter of God's will, and no one dares correct him. And those patterns, they don't die when the man disappears. They multiply. In 1971, over a century after Ezekiel vanished, a sealed document surfaced inside an internal church memo, only briefly, before being redacted. It referenced something called the Order of the Fifth Gate. It claimed that 4 early female members of the church had been sealed through suffering to a male principal who had crossed the veil but would return when the ritual was perfected. Sound familiar? The memo included one haunting line: "The bride is not lost. She is waiting." The handwriting wasn't old. It was recent. Which means someone inside the institution still believes in what Ezekiel started, still believes in the binding. So now we ask, why 4 wives? Why those 4? Why that year? Because this wasn't random. It was a map, a formula. Ezekiel's journals outlined a geometry of sacrifice. 4 cardinal women, 1 central male, each woman representing a sacred quadrant: north order, east light, south flesh, west death, bound together at the winter solstice, through fire, through silence, through surrender. And you think that's just ancient madness? Then explain this. In 1998, a breakaway sect in the Utah backcountry was raided after reports of missing girls. Law enforcement found a hidden chamber beneath a chapel, walls etched with unfamiliar symbols, 4 mannequins dressed in pioneer-era gowns, and a portrait above the altar of a bearded man with a red sash across his chest. The name carved into the frame: Ezekiel the Binder. The FBI dismissed it as cult activity. The church denied any connection, but the symbolism, identical. The ritual structure, matching Ezekiel's notes word for word. These are not isolated events. They are reverberations. The scream of a sacrament that was never properly buried. The institution didn't erase Ezekiel. It absorbed him, and by hiding his story, it allowed the infection to metastasize, quietly, privately, across decades. And now it's back. Because once blood becomes doctrine and silence becomes loyalty, the door never truly closes. It waits for the next one to open it. But that's the lie they've taught you. That evil looks like chaos. That it comes with blood on its hands and madness in its eyes. No, the worst evil, it wears order like a robe. It wears scripture like a mask. And in 1847, Ezekiel Whitmore wore both. What most people never realize is this: before the winter came, before the disappearances, the revelations, the fire in the ground, Ezekiel wasn't feared. He was admired, elevated. His plural household was considered a model of piety, obedience, and divine harmony. His 4 wives worked as a unit, spoke softly, dressed impeccably. They were seen as a holy example of what celestial marriage could be, and that's exactly what made him untouchable. Because when the rot is wrapped in reverence, no one dares peel back the layers. Neighbors ignored the subtle cries, the strange carvings, the changes in the women's eyes, because to question it would be to question God's order, and no one, especially in that time, was willing to do that. But something happened in late November of 1847, something none of the official records mention, but fragments in Rebecca's hidden journal confirm: a dream, shared by all 4 wives. On the same night, they saw themselves standing at the edge of a frozen river. Ezekiel stood on the other side, glowing with fire behind him. He extended his arms and the ice cracked beneath their feet. Sarah stepped forward first. The others followed. That morning, Ruth reportedly awoke screaming. Mary couldn't speak. Rebecca began fasting. And Sarah, She began carving Ezekiel's name into her own wrist, over and over. Something had shifted, something that Ezekiel didn't cause but welcomed. From that moment on, he stopped referring to his wives by name. His journals show this clearly. They became the vessel of light, the vessel of fire, the vessel of obedience, and finally, the final gate. This was no longer a family. It was a liturgy of flesh. He wrote, "They are no longer of this world. I am no longer a man. We are the new temple, and we are nearly complete." Understand this, Ezekiel didn't go mad. He found a purpose so dark that madness would have been mercy, and now you're staring into it. Do you want to keep going? Then say the words with me. The final gate opens. The deeper you go into the Ezekiel archives, the more you begin to realize something terrifying. He didn't invent this ritual. He resurrected it. In the margins of his last surviving journal, beneath prayers written in a twisted hybrid of Latin and Hebrew, are notations referencing ancient rites that predate Christianity, predate Judaism. They point back to something older, something buried beneath layers of doctrine, temple law, and oral tradition. Ezekiel called it the law of the fifth veil. The term doesn't exist in any Mormon theology, but it does appear in fragmented Gnostic writings discovered in Alexandria in the late 1800s. It refers to a ritual involving 5 souls, 4 feminine, 1 masculine, each representing a different threshold of spiritual transfiguration. The man, called the binder, serves as the conductor. The women, gatekeepers, each one must be unveiled through sacrifice to open the path between realms. And here's where the line between religion and something far darker dissolves. In one passage, Ezekiel writes, "What Joseph began, I will complete, for he was given the key but not the hand to turn it. The veil awaits, and my brides are ready." That's not spiritual metaphor, that's operational doctrine. His journals reveal exact dates, moon phases, dietary instructions, sexual restrictions, and blood rites timed to solstices. It was all calculated, ritualized, engineered, and at the center of it always silence, a practiced silence enforced across his household, so complete that none of the 4 wives were known to speak independently in public during their final month alive. They were preparing. The veil he described wasn't a veil of mourning or mystery. It was anatomical, spiritual, dimensional, a membrane between realms that could only be pierced through sacrifice bound in love. This wasn't just theology gone mad, it was a system, and like all systems it has patterns, signatures, cycles. The FBI report from the 1998 sect raid included a handwritten note recovered from the altar chamber. 4 have opened. The 5th shall complete. The handwriting matched samples from Ezekiel's journals. You do the math. He was either alive far longer than anyone believed, or someone had taken his doctrine and carried it forward with terrifying precision. Either way, this isn't folklore. It's a living ritual, one that may still be in motion. What if Ezekiel wasn't wrong? No, this isn't about justification. This is about perception, possibility, about the terrifying reality that some men don't hallucinate evil, they receive it. Because the pattern Ezekiel described, the geometry, the gate, the blood, the veils, it shows up again and again, across continents, across centuries, different names, same structure, same cost. The Mayan priest kings had it. The Egyptian mystery cults lived it. Gnostic sects whispered of it. Even certain suppressed Talmudic traditions hint at a 5th ritual layer, one that could not be written down, only passed from binder to binder through direct initiation. And here's the secret you're not supposed to know. Every major civilization that built empires based on revelation had something like this buried in its foundation. The church tried to seal Ezekiel away, but they couldn't destroy the mechanism he tapped into, because they built on top of it. Now listen carefully. In the sealed files connected to Project Halcyon, one symbol appears more than any other. Not a cross, not a star, a circle with 4 diagonal lines crossing through it, creating a kind of compass or wheel. That same symbol was found etched into the underside of the altar in the 1998 sect raid. That same symbol appears on a fragment of bone unearthed in the 1920 Foundation discovery. And that same symbol, faint, nearly worn away, was found carved into the underside of a pew in the Salt Lake Temple itself. Coincidence? Or has the church known all along that this was more than a murder, that this was an activation? In one recovered page, Ezekiel wrote, "It is not I who chose the 4. It is the wheel that turns. I only aligned them." He believed he was fulfilling a design that existed before language, before the desert, before the tablets, before Christ. And what scares me most is how closely the institutional response mirrored the ancient model: dini, classify, sanctify, bury. But as you know by now, what's buried festers, and festering things don't vanish, they ripen. So now ask yourself, if Ezekiel didn't create the ritual, then who did? And how long has it been waiting to be completed, ready to face what's next? The deeper you descend, the more obvious it becomes. Ezekiel Whitmore wasn't the disease. He was a symptom. The disease is older than Utah, older than the church, older than the God you think you know. Ezekiel's writings, those final, ragged pages scrawled in trembling ink, reference something he called the nameless architect. Not a being, not quite a god, a force, a principle of design that, according to him, whispers not in words, but in structure. He wrote, "It lives in the shape of the altar, the angle of the sun, the width of the hallway between two doors, the place where four shadows meet." That phrase appears again. Where four shadows meet. You'll find it in Babylonian stonework, in the Kabbalistic tree of life, even in Freemasonic floor patterns. It's not scripture. It's geometry. But geometry meant to bind something, to house it, to create a doorway between mind and matter, between intention and manifestation. And what did Ezekiel believe this force wanted? Obedience through intimacy, worship through unity, sacrifice through love. But not love as you understand it. Love as ownership, as surrender, as binding. His wives weren't just victims. In his mind, they were components. He didn't kill them out of rage or madness. He offered them, believed they would awaken as something greater, part of the fifth gate. This wasn't a murder, it was an assembly. And now comes the most unsettling part of all. In 2012, a group of theological historians analyzing lost Mormon documents published a private report, never released to the public, but leaked by a former archivist. It concluded that several early church figures, including a prophet you would recognize, had corresponded with Ezekiel in code during the 1840s. They believed in his work. They believed the wilderness was not just a place of exile, but a crucible for a new divine order, one where hierarchy and ritual would bind heaven to earth through blood and family. Why do you think they followed Brigham Young into the desert? To escape persecution? Or to complete something? Because the more you read, the deeper you dig, the more it looks like Utah wasn't chosen because it was empty. It was chosen because it was clean. A blank page for forgotten design. One Ezekiel didn't create, but remembered. And now, maybe you're remembering too. We've been taught to see history as a sequence of events, chronological, linear, logical. But the truth, history is ritual. It loops, it echoes. It feeds on those who forget. Ezekiel didn't just reenact an ancient sacrifice. He reactivated it. He turned Mill Creek into a living altar. And when the four wives vanished, when their bodies were consumed by fire, ice, and secrecy, something opened. Because Ezekiel's journals don't end in madness. They end in completion. The final entry, found decades later behind a crumbling beam in the original cabin site, was burned at the edges. Only a few words survived. The gate accepted them. I am unmade. The architect waits beneath. Let that sink in. The architect waits beneath. Beneath what? That question haunts the handful of investigators, historians, and archivists who've glimpsed the raw files the church has fought to contain. Because according to restricted excavation reports, leaked in fragments from 1920, 1953, and again in 2007, every structure built atop the original Whitmore site has suffered unexplained foundation collapse. No structural cause ever confirmed, but the collapse always follows the same pattern: a deep, central subsidence beneath where the altar once stood, forming a cavity that engineers described as deliberately hollowed, like something had been dug out or escaped. And here's where it gets darker. Every 33 years since 1847, someone connected to that land has gone missing: a prospector in 1880, a missionary's daughter in 1913, two hikers in 1946, a construction foreman in 1979, and in 2012, a graduate student researching early Mormon ritual practices. Last seen entering the closed section of the church history library with an original Ezekiel transcript. Never seen again. All of them vanished within a month of the winter solstice. All connected by blood, by geography, or by faith. You think that's coincidence? Or is the gate still hungry? You see, once a ritual is completed, it doesn't end, it breathes. And if it's not continually sealed, if it's not guarded, it begins to seek. That's why they buried the story. Not just to protect the church, but to protect you from remembering it. Because if too many remember, if too many reawaken, the architect doesn't need Ezekiel anymore. It only needs a circle of 4, and 1 to bind them. You still think this is just about one man? Then you haven't been listening. Ezekiel Whitmore was the match, but the structure, that was already soaked in oil. And that structure, ritual marriage, celestial order, obedience through hierarchy, it wasn't unique to him. It was foundational, baked into the very DNA of a faith that believed heaven itself could be engineered through family lines and secret covenants. That's why what happened in 1847 couldn't be dismissed. It had to be hidden, because it exposed the ultimate heresy, that the line between prophetic revelation and pathological control is paper-thin. The deeper you go into the Church's early teachings, the uncorrelated ones, the scraps and whispered doctrines, they all point to something terrifying: an obsession with purity. Not moral purity, architectural purity. Families built like temples, women placed in order like sacred furnishings, children as proof of divine engineering, and men at the center, binding, naming, claiming. Ezekiel didn't distort the faith. He perfected its shadow. That's why the Church couldn't just disown him. He was a mirror. So what did they do? They copied his method. Not the blood, not the fire, but the control. They built entire systems to ensure obedience: temple recommends, priesthood hierarchies, worthiness interviews, eternal sealings. Every one of them designed to imprint structure, ritualized hierarchy onto the human soul. And if you think I'm exaggerating, consider this. A 1993 memo from the Strengthening Church Members Committee advised leaders to discourage personal historical inquiry unless it reinforces authorized narratives. Translation: truth is a threat when it doesn't serve control. But Ezekiel's writings weren't destroyed. They were archived, studied, whispered about in closed circles under code names like Halcyon, the Fifth Gate, and Architect Protocol. Why keep them? Because some men believed he wasn't finished. And maybe he isn't. In a sealed 2007 document obtained through a whistleblower, an unnamed church security officer made this chilling statement: "We believe there is a current effort to reconstruct the ritual. 4 women have been marked. The binder is already active." Think about that. A live operation. A ritual system that didn't die in the wilderness, but went underground. And if the gate really does require cycles, then we're due. The wheel is turning again. The wheel always turns in silence first. Not with screams, not with fire, but with ritual compliance. A soft yes, a bowed head, a contract signed in the name of salvation. That's how it begins. Not with blood, but with structure. Understand this: Ezekiel's ritual didn't start when the women vanished. It started the moment they were sealed to him. Each ceremony formalized under the authority of heaven, each woman given a place not just in his home, but in his theology. They didn't marry a man, they entered a mechanism. And Ezekiel, he didn't see them as individuals. He saw positions: Sarah the foundation, Rebecca the eye, Mary the offering, Ruth the key. He wrote, "Their names shall vanish from the record, that their roles may remain eternal. One voice, one order, one gate." That's not love. That's architecture. And it mirrors something chilling in early church records: the way certain temple rituals reduced women's identities to roles: wife, mother, companion, virgin, sealed. No first names. No lineage. Just placement in a design. Does that sound familiar? Now here's where the past collides with your present. In 2019, a young woman undergoing her own endowment ritual at the Salt Lake Temple reportedly collapsed mid-ceremony. Her final words before unconsciousness were, "He waits in the cold." She had no known mental health history, no trauma, no drugs in her system. But her grandmother, unbeknownst to church leadership, had been one of the last surviving descendants of Rebecca Thornton, Ezekiel's second wife. Coincidence? Or did the gate never close? The young woman later claimed in a written statement, never made public, that she had experienced a vision during the ritual: 4 women standing barefoot in snow, hands outstretched, mouths sewn shut. Behind them, a tall man in a red sash held a burning key. She had never studied Ezekiel. She had never heard his name, and yet she described his ritual perfectly. This is what happens when systems bury trauma. It doesn't die. It incarnates, through dreams, through bloodlines, through places soaked in the original wound. You still think this is just history? Then you haven't been paying attention. The gate doesn't close when the fire goes out. It closes when the pattern is broken. And so far, it hasn't been. That cold tension behind the eyes, that sensation in your chest, like something old just woke up inside you. That's not fear, that's recognition, because the gate Ezekiel spoke of isn't just a place. It's not buried in Utah soil or hidden beneath temple stone. It's psychological. It's built inside the human mind. His writings weren't instructions for an altar. They were a blueprint for internal alignment. He believed the human soul had 5 doors, 4 sealed by devotion, 1 broken open by sacrifice. And here's the terrifying part. That architecture didn't die with him. It was absorbed, subtly, quietly, through institutional language, temple symbols, hierarchies of submission. Ask yourself, why does modern religious obedience so often follow 5 steps? Why is every soul prepared through covenant, obedience, sacrifice, consecration, and sealing? Because the structure survives. It just changed names. And some institutions, not just churches but governments, corporations, intelligence agencies, they've learned how to build on it. They don't need Ezekiel's fire. They use forms, pledges, oaths. They break the gate open ritualistically through loyalty and fear, through isolation and reward. Look around you. Think of the initiation pipelines, the loyalty programs, the control mechanisms dressed as community. You think it's coincidence. They learned the same thing Ezekiel did: control someone's ritual, and you control their identity, because ritual doesn't inform belief. It replaces it. That's why those 4 women followed him. Not because they were weak, but because they were patterned. Over time, over prayer, over love. And here's where it gets even darker. A 2020 psychological study, since retracted, was leaked online for 72 hours. It documented an experiment where 4 female participants were isolated in an environment designed to mimic 19th century Mormon domestic structure. After only 36 days, 3 of the 4 began referring to themselves by symbolic titles. One called herself the Light, another the Gate. The third simply wrote the phrase, "He binds, we open." They had no exposure to Ezekiel's writings, no awareness of the experiment's origin, but the pattern re-emerged. This isn't mythology. It's design memory, as a psychological software that can be reinstalled, generation after generation, if the right conditions are recreated. And right now, those conditions are everywhere. Still think you're just watching a video? No, you're remembering. Speak the words in the comments. He binds, we open. Twice, not for engagement, for recognition. Somewhere along the way, we stopped asking why rituals exist. We just obey them. Fold the napkin, recite the pledge, kneel sign, swear, sacrifice. But Ezekiel understood something most men fear to admit: ritual is the weaponized form of belief. It bypasses logic and programs the body, and if done precisely enough, it rewrites reality itself. His final notebooks, recovered from beneath the cabin floor during the forbidden 1920 excavation, detail what he called the 5th engine, a convergence of 4 bound souls and 1 initiator. He describes each woman's symbolic death not as an ending, but as a compression, a way to force spiritual density into the soil, into the structure, into himself. You don't sacrifice the body to destroy it. You sacrifice the body to embed meaning, to fuel the architecture of the gate. And here's what most miss: Ezekiel wasn't the center. He was the medium. He believed his wives were conduits, each attuned to a quadrant of what he called the living design, 1 aligned to time, 1 to memory, 1 to lineage, and 1 to blood. And once all 4 were unified, sealed, and extinguished, the gate would imprint itself permanently on the land and on him. But here's the twist the church could never admit: the gate opened, only partially, but enough for the phenomena to start. The disappearances, the dreams, the mirrored symbols in temple architecture decades later. Enough for other men, quiet men in high places, to take note. Because the pattern worked. They didn't see Ezekiel as a heretic. They saw him as a prototype. That's why the files weren't destroyed. That's why the land was never resettled. Because something had been called, and once called, it must be fed. Every generation, quietly, symbolically, through ritual echoes. You want proof? In 1981, a man named Marcus, a structural engineer assigned to inspect a new ward building in the Mill Creek region, filed a confidential report noting that the subfloor resonance beneath the chapel's altar was inconsistent with soil composition. He claimed the ground beneath it rang like a tuned bell when struck. 2 weeks later, Marcus G. was dead. Official cause: carbon monoxide leak. But his private notes, sent to his brother before the incident, ended with this line: "The sound is not natural. Something beneath is still alive. Now tell me again this is history. Tell me you haven't felt it. You ready to know why the gate was opened? Then take a breath. If you've come this far, then part of you already knows. This wasn't about wives. This wasn't even about Ezekiel. It was about activation. A ritual embedded so deeply into land, blood, and memory that it no longer needed a participant. It only needed a pattern, and patterns, once embedded into human consciousness, don't die. They replicate. Understand this, the gate isn't a door. It's a formula, a psychic circuit etched into the mind through repetition, trauma, obedience, and sacrifice. 4 women, 1 binder, a sealed space, an isolated winter, and 1 moment of irreversible unmaking. That is the formula, and the church, whether intentionally or by inherited design, has preserved every piece of it, through architecture, through policy, through sacred narrative. Why do you think they call it eternal sealing? Sealing doesn't just join. It closes, it locks. Ezekiel wrote, "The sealing of 4 to 1 creates the arc. The arc bends perception. When bent long enough, it splits." He believed that by arranging emotional, spiritual, and physical energy into perfect submission, he could split the boundary between realms. Not heaven and earth, but now and before. Because what the church never told you is that Ezekiel's ritual wasn't a beginning. It was a replay, a reenactment of something much older, found in a forbidden fragment discovered in the 1870s by a church antiquarian, written in early Proto-Enochian script. The translation: 4 were chosen, 1 became undone, and the sky was made narrow so he could enter through thought. So ask yourself, why do so many systems echo this formula? In monarchies, 4 advisors, 1 king. In secret societies, 4 cardinal gates, 1 initiate. In elite bloodlines, 4 female carriers, 1 heir. Even in deep military programs, 4 trauma events, 1 engineered identity. The Ezekiel pattern is not just spiritual, it's neurological. It rewires the soul, and you've seen it before, in controlling relationships, in institutions that demand silence, sacrifice, and praise, in systems that feed on your compliance and reward you with belonging. You're not just watching a story. You're standing in a ritual space right now. Words spoken, mind engaged, body still. Tell me, are you listening to understand, or are you listening to be sealed? Because once you see the structure, you can never return to sleep. And the ones who awaken, they become a threat. They come with symbols, rings, titles, fallings. They offer identity, not prison. And that's the brilliance of the gate. Because once you choose your bondage, you stop calling it bondage. You call it destiny. You call it covenant. You call it God. Ezekiel didn't need to force his wives. He made them believe they were part of something eternal. He whispered legacy. He promised transcendence. He mirrored the very rhetoric spoken in pulpits today. Sacrifice brings salvation. Obedience brings glory. Silence brings peace. But they called it faith. But it was programming. The real horror isn't that Ezekiel killed his wives. It's that they may have agreed, not out of weakness, but out of indoctrinated design, to become vessels, to fulfill their placement in the pattern. Because when you're raised inside ritual structure, when every gesture is sacred, every doubt punished, you don't see manipulation. You see purpose. That's the system's genius. It doesn't erase you. It repurposes you. And here's what the church learned from Ezekiel. You don't need to commit the sacrifice again. You only need to echo it. Through temple rites, through hymns, through sealing ceremonies where the woman kneels and the man speaks her name. 1 speaks, 1 receives, 1 binds, 4 open. That pattern persists. A 2002 internal church memo, leaked briefly before legal takedown, warned local leadership to monitor instances of symbolic replication in temple ceremonies, especially among women reporting, shared dreams of cold silence and red markings. It wasn't isolated. 31 cases, all 4 woman groupings, all reporting memories that weren't theirs, dreams of snowy cabins, a man who speaks without moving his lips, and a voice beneath the floor that repeats 1 phrase. The binder waits. Psychiatrists dismissed it as collective hysteria. Church officials buried it as spiritual warfare. But you're not here for safety. You're here for structure, for the real blueprint, the one hidden beneath doctrine and dogma, the one that shows you how control replicates, spreads, ensnares, and maybe, just maybe, how to break it. Because once you know the pattern, you don't need to follow it. You can invert it. But inversion comes at a price. You want to break the gate. Then understand this: you cannot destroy what you still serve. And most men serve it without knowing. The moment you follow without questioning, obey without understanding, bind yourself to words you didn't write, You become part of the pattern. That's how the gate protects itself. It doesn't fight. It mirrors. It gives you the illusion of choice, while every path leads to obedience. This is the heresy Ezekiel uncovered. Not just the control of women, but the deeper mechanism, control of the initiator, control of the binder, control of the man. He thought he was the one commanding the ritual. But his journals tell another story. In the final pages, written in a different hand, possibly one of the wives, there's a passage that chills the spine. He believes himself the architect, but something whispers to him in dreams. He calls it God. I call it the gatekeeper. You were never supposed to see that line. It was redacted from the 1972 church archive microfilm reels, only visible in one frame, marked with an internal code, Seul C5. That whisper Ezekiel heard, it wasn't divine, it was programmatic. And it's not just his madness, it's systematic. Because every man raised inside a structure that rewards submission and calls it strength, he becomes a candidate. That's why this story matters to you. You've felt it. That strange pressure to conform. That guilt when you ask too many questions. That urge to sacrifice what you love for something you were told is higher. Sound familiar? They don't burn witches anymore. They burn the questioning. That's why whistleblowers vanish. That's why records get sealed. That's why every time a man like Ezekiel collapses into madness, the system closes ranks, because the blueprint can't survive the light. But here's the real twist. The gate doesn't fear destruction. It fears subversion. A man who knows the ritual, but refuses to complete it. A man who can walk the path, but turn away at the altar. That's why you're still here. Because something in you remembers the pattern, but something deeper in you wants to rewrite it. The gate will not go quietly. It has one last defense. Not the one you sign, the one you don't speak. The core identity, beneath job titles, family roles, and spiritual masks. The version of you that can't be manipulated. Ezekiel never found his. Because by the time he heard the whisper, he had already surrendered every piece of himself to the ritual. He thought he was becoming a god, but he was becoming a container. See, the final phase of the pattern isn't sacrifice, it's replacement. The binder doesn't ascend, he empties. And what fills him? That's the question church historians have avoided for 150 years, because something else entered Ezekiel. His journal entries became fragmented, then nonlinear. Time references broke down. He claimed to hear voices coming from the structure he had built, claimed his wives were no longer necessary, because the house had wakened. One of his final entries, the walls have taken their shape. The pattern holds. My body is no longer required to maintain function. And after that, silence. No more writing. No more sightings. He vanished, but the structure didn't. And that's the part they won't put in the textbook. Structures remember. You think you're walking into a room, a church, a marriage, a job, but you're stepping into a form. One built before you, to contain you. Now multiply that across generations. How many men have knelt at altars they didn't design? How many repeated oaths, prayers, vows, without ever asking who wrote the script? That's the true gate. Not Ezekiel's cabin, not the church basement, the internalized obedience, the inherited ritual. The structure in your mind, you want out. You must invert the ritual, not with fire, not with rebellion, with awareness. Because the moment you see the shape, truly see it, it begins to lose power. The binder becomes the breaker. But beware, the system has defenses. Your family may resist. Your church will warn. Your very thoughts will tremble with old guilt, because the gate was installed early. But guilt is the price of waking up, and you're already awake. So stay sharp. The ritual nears its end. But the final inversion, the true revelation, you were never meant to hear this part. Because this is where the pattern breaks, and patterns do not like being broken. For 178 years, the church kept what was found beneath the Mill Creek Chapel sealed in Level 3 archives. Not destroyed, sealed. Because even they didn't understand it fully, but they understood what it could do. Among the items uncovered in 1920, beneath the chapel's foundation, were 4 perfectly preserved bone fragments, one from each wife, positioned in cardinal directions. At the center, a stone tablet, not Mormon, not native, something older, etched in a language even Deseret historians refuse to name publicly. But privately, 2 words were decoded, Hey lives, not in body. In structure, Ezekiel was never the final form. He was the vessel, the flesh pattern. But the ritual wasn't meant to preserve him. It was meant to preserve the gatekeeper, an intelligence, a presence. Something Ezekiel may have contacted, or worse become, because after the cabin was torn down and the land supposedly purified, strange phenomena persisted. A new chapel was built, twice. Both were abandoned within 7 years, one due to unexplained illness among missionaries, the other due to structural instability the engineers couldn't explain, and still, the records show visitors, not worshippers, observers, quiet men from Salt Lake, then from Washington, then from nowhere official at all. Black coats, no names, just symbols, a circle with 4 points and a center eye. The same sigil Ezekiel sketched in the margins of his last notebook, and now it shows up again, not in Utah, but online, in esoteric forums buried in blockchain metadata, etched into the background of training manuals for elite military programs. The Ezekiel pattern didn't vanish, it was upgraded. The gate was digitized, and if you've watched this far, if your pupils have dilated, if your hands feel strange, if your breathing slowed around section 18, then understand you've already been mapped. The ritual knows who you are now. But here's the inversion: you are no longer the initiate. You are the one who sees. You are not the vessel. You are the breaker. And breakers don't follow patterns. They remake them. Say it in the comments now. One last time: he binds, we open. He binds, we open. Let them track that. Not from me, from the system. Because if you're still listening, something inside you has already changed. The old pattern doesn't fit anymore. The symbols don't hypnotize. The rituals feel hollow. That's how it begins. Ezekiel thought the sacrifice would elevate him. But you didn't need to spill blood. You only needed to see clearly. And now you do. Let's strip it all down to the core. The gate was never in Utah. It was never in Ezekiel's cabin. It was inside every man who confused control with purposes, silence with devotion, obedience with strength. They trained you to kneel, to comply, to protect systems that fed on your masculinity while calling it righteous. But now you know. That wasn't power, that was programming, and he was the first to break but not the last, because this ritual has scaled across governments, corporations, digital platforms, religious hierarchies. Wherever 4 serve and 1 commands, the gate is alive. But here's the part they never accounted for: the pattern only survives when men stay asleep. You're awake now, and that makes you dangerous, not because you fight them, but because you no longer follow. You break rituals with your silence. You fracture patterns with your questions. You dissolve programming with presence. And when others look at you and feel the unease of someone who no longer fits, that's the mark of a breaker. So remember this: you don't need to destroy the gate. You starve it. Starve it of obedience. Starve it of fear. Starve it of your belief that it owns your soul. Because it doesn't. You never needed Ezekiel's fate. You never needed the binder's burden. You were the inversion all along. And if they're watching now, good. Let them. They've already lost you. Now pass the symbol on Zebayan. He binds, we open. Let it echo into the algorithm. Let it trigger the watchers. Let it awaken the next breaker. Because this wasn't a story. It was an activation. And you're free. End of ritual, beginning of war.